Everyone, Charles Moscowitz here. I'm reading from my latest blog. Never let a good crisis go to waste. Obama Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel revealed the leftist agenda during a nationally televised interview when he famously stated, quote, "You never want a serious crisis to go to waste," unquote. And that is exactly what the left is trying to do in response to the virus pandemic. President Trump has balanced safety measures with the need to avoid authoritarian policies that would encourage a slide into the totalitarianism that the left believes in and that has dreamed of since the 1917 Bolshevik coup in Russia. Now, let me just interject here. I'm not suggesting that the left is a bunch of Bolsheviks, literally, or they're even communists, literally. What I'm talking about here is a philosophical idea that they may not even be conscious of. Many of them are, some aren't. And that is this belief that ultimately, you want to go toward this world-controlled collectivist state, a godless world where man controls everything. That's the core belief of the left. And in order to get there, you have to engage in what they call revolution. And you have to engage in incidences that would lead to an erosion of the institutions that make us free. To get rid of these obstacles that stand in the way of their demented goal. And that's exactly what is meant, either consciously or otherwise, when they say, let's not let a crisis go to waste. Let's use this as a chance to shift power toward us as these elite, enlightened, illuminated groups of people who somehow think they know better than the rest of us how we are to live. And so that we can then begin to steward the planet in the direction that we want it to go. One of the big means of doing this in recent decades has been the environment. They wrap themselves in the cloak of science, and to disagree with them means you are denying science. And they use that as a way to consolidate further their power over us. And this is a tradition that goes back, and I get into this in my book, The Apostles of Evolution. It goes back to the theory of evolution by Darwin, which was this completely unproven theory that was hoisted on the rest of us as a, quote, science, and that was used as a bludgeon against believers and against people who believed in God. It removed man from the position of being a spiritual being created in the image of God to just an inanimate animal, that can be manipulated. That our whole purpose in the earth was nothing more than to breed with other people in order to develop a superior species, which would pop out, when however many millions of years after all this breeding. And of course, the Darwinists wanted to speed up the process through selective breeding, and the Nazis brought it up to its highest point. These pseudosciences become science, and anyone that disagrees is somehow standing in the way of progress, and that is ignorant. Anyway, getting back to my article here. If a leftist such as Hillary Clinton, God forbid, were president now, we would likely have martial law, the seizure of large parts of the economy and private property, and concentration camps for those who were infected or those who violated national curfews. Does anybody doubt that? I mean, really? We should be grateful that Donald Trump is the president, and that the use of a crisis, we should understand this crisis, and we should, in a sense, learn from the crisis. One thing we should learn is that elections matter, and that the person that is elected, that's something that can change the course of history. Thank God we're in a position where we have a steady chief magistrate, a chief administrator, that being President Trump, who is not moving us in that direction, who's resisting the forces that want to go in that direction. At the core of the disloyal left, their criticism of the Trump administration, the underlying thesis of theirs, is that he has not been totalitarian enough. Isn't that true? They contend that he has not moved fast enough in their version of the Brave New World. As is par for the course for the left, their criticism is situational. As President Trump closed the border to China in January, when the news of the virus was first revealed. And by the way, in January, when President Trump closed the border, he also set up the pandemic task force that includes Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx and others. And he began to check people's temperatures at the airport, and steps began to be taken. And at that time, anyone who was paying attention remembers that the left was howling with anger. Oh, this is, anyway, I'll get into that. Let me read on in my article here. Okay, so we closed the border in January. At that time, they howled in rage with the obnoxious claim that Trump was motivated in his action by a prejudice against Chinese men and women. Indeed, such a measure was prudent and proper, as it slowed down the spread. It took Canada, after Prime Minister Trudeau attacked Trump for his actions regarding China, only a week ago, or maybe less than a week ago, to finally close their borders. Now, this is months later, and already Canada has been completely infected. Likewise, the European Union only got around to closing their borders after there were 1,000 deaths in Italy. So in other words, all of these people who were the globalists, and they're like, oh, we have to have open borders because there's some virtue to this, that and criticized Trump as being ignorant and a bigot, they all got around to closing the borders eventually, because ultimately, if they don't, then the whole jig will be up, because everyone will see that, the fraudulent nature of their system of beliefs. And there would be a reaction because everybody would start to die. So they did eventually do it. Trump's response has been to reassert the basic prerogative of national sovereignty, and he was right to do so. Any sovereign nation, and in reflection of the sovereign rights of the individual, of the citizen and the family, has a moral and a practical right and obligation to protect the life and the safety of its members. Indeed, such a sovereign right, the right to determine who enters the national home and why, has even extended now to the states in some cases, as various states have begun, within the confines of the law, to try to prevent the migration of people entering from virus hotspots like New York City. I mean, right here in Rhode Island, for example, near where I am, the state is checking people as they come across the border if they have New York license plates. I mean, you've got Florida basically watching the border of Georgia. You've got Ohio and Indiana watching the border of Michigan. I mean, these things are, in a way, the concept of borders has even become, I mean, in Massachusetts, there's talk in the Cape Cod about shutting the 2 bridges if they go to the Cape to protect it from people going to their summer homes who might be infected. And rightfully, now that the virus is underway, this virus that threatens our lives and that nobody wants to catch, you have to, people are suddenly waking up and realizing that borders matter, that, protecting our families and ourselves by staying in home during the crisis is no different than a nation protecting itself by keeping its national home protected from those who may bring in the crisis, or for any other reason. I mean, this is what sovereignty is all about, partially. This is a basic part of sovereignty. It's the right to determine who enters your space and why. That is basic. That's a basic concept that's part of private property. It's something that the animal kingdom understands. It's something that the plants understand. Try to go into a bird's nest if you're not welcome, or try to interrupt a beaver dam and see what happens, or go into the space of a dog, right? I mean, animals know this instinctively, but we have, of course, human beings who have a very unnatural and bizarre agenda who try to subvert this and who try to say, no, we shouldn't pay attention to borders. If somehow a border is anachronistic, it's ignorant, it's old-fashioned, it's outdated. Really? Check out what's happening now. President Trump has balanced a proper response to the crisis with the protection of civil liberties. He has enacted emergency powers that were granted by Congress, but he has employed them sparingly and only as a last resort in terms of dealing with manufacturers to produce products such as ventilators and other specific examples. He hasn't gone in like what de Blasio called for, which is a nationalization of whole segments of business, like what they did in Cuba or what they did in communist countries. Trump has not done that. Believe me, if the left were in charge, they probably would have done it. He has worked with the individual states as a partner, trying to address their unique needs and conditions, while avoiding the federalization of power that would have rendered the states as legally meaningless, right? In other words, he hasn't federalized the problem to the extent that the left would like. He has kept solutions local and regional while serving a role as a federal administrator, a partnership role. That's how it should be done in this country. That's what the Constitution calls for. That is the separation of powers. The states, Article 9 and 10 of the Bill of Rights, the states are sovereign and the individual is ultimately sovereign. And that in an emergency, yes, we expect the federal government to step up and even take some extraordinary powers, and they have under President Trump. But only if necessary, only to deal with an emergency. And then it's easier to go back to the status quo ante once the crisis is over, which is, of course, the key for why the left is also upset. After all, we have to, learn from the crisis, as Rahm Emanuel said, right? Don't let a good crisis go to waste. President Trump has tried to not engage in the kind of hype and fear-mongering and the hysterical predictions and the histrionics that have emanated from the left's mouthpieces in segments of the media. And we've all heard this. They'll yell and scream if you if you disagree with their projections that this thing could go on through the summer. It could go on for a year. I mean, I read an email from someone who's, I'm not going to name because it was private, but a prominent figure on the left who said that she expects this to go on for 2 years. I mean, this is, they've gone insane. It's not going to, this is a virus. It's going to come and go. We have to stay in, and then once it crests and starts to recede, then we could get back to normal. And I'll get into what I think we could do then, what the lessons we can learn. But anyway, back to my article here. The fact that the left has not gotten its wish as of yet, that the crisis is being wasted, quote unquote, according to the occult-like view, along with the visceral hatred and fear of Donald Trump and the freedom-oriented movement that he leads, this is leading them further down the dark road of sedition and treason. Their fear-mongering, their trivializing analysis of every word the president utters, it's disloyal in the real sense right now, especially in the middle of a real crisis. There's no time for that now. There's no time for saying, he gave a press conference, but there weren't women there or some crap like that. This isn't the time for that. There's never the time for it, but especially not now. Particularly odious and despicable is an example I give here, was a recent assertion by an unnamed author of an editorial in the book published by the Boston Globe that asserted that President Trump has, quote, blood on his hands, unquote. Let's make sure that we stay the course. Let's make sure that we stay safe in these times when we face a real threat, which is in the form of this invisible deadly virus. While at the same time, let's watch out for the exploiters of the crisis. Let's watch out for those who would try to make political hay. And I'll do a separate video on what some of the lessons that we can learn from this crisis, which I think are good lessons. And hopefully going forward, we'll see a societal shift in certain ways. But I'll leave it at that today on this video. And I'll thank you for watching. Charles Moscowitz. Check out my website, charlesmoskowitz.com. Thank you. Have a great afternoon and be safe.